Buongiorno, buenos dias, bonjour, good morning. I'd like to warmly thank the organizers of this excellent meeting for inviting me for this session on choosing the future for terrace landscapes. I wish I had arrived earlier, but I could not, but I'm very happy to be here today. I also realize that coming towards the end of the morning means that I have an advantage or a disadvantage, depending on how you see things, that many of the speakers who preceded me have already touched on a number of points. So forgive me if there's repetition. I hope I can complement their perspective rather than slavishly repeat. I think there are differences, which is the purpose of this morning, to give multiple perspectives and provocations to stimulate thinking about possible futures. So this is really about possible worlds. So there's a place for blue sky thinking, or others would call utopia. Much of my thinking on this comes through conversations with small-scale farmers, indigenous peoples, pastoralists, peasants. A lot of my thinking has benefited from their conversations about how they can move from a current very dire situation to something better. And some of those, they also involve urban dwellers, particularly young people. So I hope I can reflect some of their views here. I've chosen to talk about food sovereignty and explore with you the implications, the possible implications for the governance and management of terrace landscapes. And I'm repeating what Sylvia mentioned this morning. I think there's been a very important development in civil society, social movements over the last 20 years, and this is what is essentially a farmer's response to the multiple social, environmental, and economic crises that are undermining food, agriculture, and land everywhere. An organization that has championed thinking about food sovereignty is La Via Campesina, representing about 200 million farmers. We heard this morning. Started in 1996 to put the idea of food sovereignty on the table of the United Nations, the FAO, in contrast to the concept of food security. And since then, there have been a number of gatherings around the world, including Mali, Cuba, Austria, to further refine this concept of food sovereignty and extend it to other social groups, not just farmers, but also slum dwellers, citizens, consumers, younger people. So there's been a broadening out, and the next meeting will take place in Europe, in Romania, in 2 weeks' time. Another meeting of the Nielini tradition that will focus on food sovereignty. So if I try to summarize food sovereignty, really, it's to do with a transformative process that tries to recreate a democratic political realm and regenerate a diversity of autonomous food systems based on social justice, equity, and ecological sustainability. And another defining feature of food sovereignty is that it's really a self-organizing process whereby citizens exercise their collective power to reclaim spaces that are controlled by what are often disabling governments and corporations. I think we have to recognize the emancipatory quality of the food sovereignty movement. And very briefly, some of the principles are chiefly the right of people to define their own food and agricultural policies, the rights of access, equitable rights of access, control over land, water, seeds, livestock breeds and territories, and obviously an emphasis on ecologically sustainable production, principally agroecological production and artisanal fisheries that depend on a high level of biological diversity and indigenous knowledge. And in the economic realm, the right to protect and regulate domestic agricultural production and trade, for example, restricting dumping of cheap food from other parts of the world, which depress local markets and deprive farmers, even in Europe, of viable market outlets for their produce. So what I want to focus on what I think are possibly 4 prerequisites that are needed to regenerate local ecologies and economies. If a group of people, a group of citizens decides to walk the talk of food sovereignty, what are some of the prerequisites that we need to look at? There are more, but I just want to focus on these. One, a search for a new modernity and peasant identity. I use the word peasant not in a pejorative sense, but in a very positive sense, and I'm happy talking about that separately. A shift from linear to circular food systems and a circular economy generally. The need to rethink economics, trade and markets, and a deepening of democracy. And I'd like to look at these in turn. Now, the reason why I'm starting here is because terraces, as we've seen, are human-made environments. They're embodiment of people's knowledge, their labor, and their sense of beauty. So it's really appropriate to focus first and foremost on farmers as architects of those landscapes, and think about farmers today and what future is open to them under current circumstances. It's not good, as we heard. The mainstream policies are encouraging an exodus of people from rural areas to work in industry and urban-based services, and terrace landscapes have historically suffered pretty early on from this process of industrialization and decline in the primary sector in favor of the tertiary sector. But this is going on today. The French government, or at least an interministerial body, produced a report saying that something like 10,000 farmers leave agriculture before their retirement age. 10,000 farmers every year. That's a third of the number of farmers who leave every year. And the reasons why we've got this alarming departure of farmers before reaching retirement age is that the banks don't want to lend them money. The farmers themselves are bankrupt. They're not able to pay back the investments they've made. They are isolated geographically, socially, and they find it more and more difficult to deal and absorb with shocks and stresses, often imposed or brought about by climate change or market volatility. So it's quite rare for farmers to survive 2 bad years in a row. And also considerably high levels of suicide. This is a feature across the world. If you look at the US, the level of suicides among farmers is equivalent to the level of suicides in prisons. So I think this is a very important starting point, and we have to understand why there are now organized reactions on the part of the peasantry and concerned citizens to invent another world and go in the direction of food sovereignty. The global restructuring of agri-food systems also threatens these local food systems, with a few transnational corporations gaining monopoly control over each link in the food chain. Currently, we're talking about 3 mega mergers in the seed industry. If those mega mergers take place between Monsanto and Bayer, China Chemical and Syngenta, and Dow and DuPont, something like 3 companies will control 70% of the commercial seed sector worldwide. Similarly, with agrochemicals, 72% of that market is controlled by a very, very small handful of powerful companies. But these companies also exert a considerable degree at all levels, global, national, European Union, a degree of control over regulatory frameworks. They specify the rules that govern food systems, and they have monopolistic networks of people and resources that influence the shape of things in ways that suit their interests. And the net result for many farmers is that there's a cost-price squeeze. The cost of their inputs is going up, and the prices they're receiving are going down. And this is a major factor of bankruptcy and misery in the farming world. And of course, that system is characterized by very high ecological footprints. This is a graph from the Stockholm Resilience Institute, clearly showing that globally we're overshooting planetary boundaries, particularly in terms of genetic diversity, they're in red, and phosphorus and nitrogen loads. Agriculture and modern food systems are centrally implicated in these overshoots. The nitrogen, for example, the intensive livestock sector and the value chains that provide feed for animals in factory farms. Very, very heavy ecological footprints. So at the same time, we're seeing that a lot of people everywhere, and particularly younger people, they're increasingly rejecting this idea of development as a process of commodification of nature and social relations. And there is more and more consideration about new forms of farming, giving new meanings to the notion of peasant, redefining what a peasant is, and there's increasing talk about repeasantization as a new form of modernity in the 21st century. The shape, the form that will take is still to be invented. It's certainly not to reproduce what was there before in discussions, and certainly the policy environment should be a lot more enabling to allow this kind of reconnection with the land in productive and useful ways and aesthetic ways. I think this is a point for discussion. What could that peasant modernity look like? And under what conditions can it thrive with dignity and joy and conviviality? Big challenges. The next one, focusing on linear to circular food systems. Well, we essentially have, nearly at all levels, even in local food systems, we essentially have a linear and increasingly globalized structure that assumes that the Earth has an abundant supply of natural resources at one end and a limitless capacity to absorb waste and pollution at the other end of the line. And we have incredibly complex systems that provide our food based on principle of standardization, geographical division of labor, comparative advantage, and these are extremely resource, capital intensive and energy intensive. Many years ago, people calculated the energy cost of an egg produced industrially. You need 15 units of fossil fuel energy to produce 1 calorie worth of egg. Now, there's a lot of talk about moving away from these profligate systems in terms of resource, they're very, very damaging, to fundamentally different systems. And here nature is being used as a model to be mimicked. Hence the talk of agroecology, agroforestry, where essentially you reassemble a diversity of plant and animal species into functional wholes to do the job which these industrial systems were doing. So these systems sponsoring their own soil fertility, their recycling nutrients, producing in situ, their pest control mechanisms, etc. And some of the key metaphors here are agroecology, of course, which is a science, a practice, but also a reflection of a social movement, and works very hard to assemble functional wholes of plants and animals in intercropping, polyculture, agroforestry systems, agro-silvopastoral systems, but increasingly peri-urban and urban farms, so working at different scales across the rural-urban continuum. But you also have within that a whole family of approaches to do with eco-literacy and eco-design, biomimicry, permaculture and holistic design, as well as models of circular economy. Now, I think what's important to note here is that much of the discussions over the last 30 years has focused on sustainable agriculture, renewable energy system, water purification in silos. They've been sectoral approaches. And here, when we talk about circular economy models, we have to think about how can we link up food and energy production with water and waste management in circular systems that relocalize production and consumption. This is a significant difference in approach. It's bringing together these sectors and producing circular economies that can generate wealth for local inhabitants, but also reduce carbon footprints and ecological footprints, and be deployed in ways that support local control and democracy, as well as conviviality and diverse definitions of human well-being. And it's not just the farming system, it's the whole food system. I want to talk to you about tomato ketchup. You know, tomato ketchup, which we find on the supermarket shelf, the average bottle requires about 150 process and transport steps for its production. When you factor in the plastic that goes into the bottle, the energy, the manufacture of gases and metals, etc. And that can be, you know, easily overcome through a much more elegant approach, which is based on circular economy principles, whereby tomatoes are grown through agroecological means to reduce fertilizer and pesticide inputs. Rather than use plastic bottles, we're using glass bottles. In temperate latitudes, we'll be using greenhouses as well as biogas as a source of energy. And we're essentially closing nutrient loops and ensuring that the carbon footprints of those systems are much, much lower. The advantage is that when you start relocalizing production and consumption often in that way is that you do reduce not only harmful environmental impacts, but you can also retain more wealth in the locality. Needless to say, in the industrial model, there are intermediaries, there are actors at every stage of those 150 steps, and they're pocketing money. And some people would say these systems have been designed for profit maximization. They're irrational, but from the point of view of shareholders of company, this is extremely logical. So, high levels of reuse and recycling. I won't go into this, you've covered this very well. Self-reliance and the proximity principle, and diversity, multifunctionality, and complexity. Let me move to this one. Looking for more enabling economics, markets and property rights. And I'd like to start with this one, property rights and tenure. It's not just Brazil, it's not just the Philippines that have terribly skewed land ownership patterns. Europe has a real problem. The level of land concentration and inequity in land distribution is huge in Europe. Something like 50% of the land in Europe is controlled by 3% of the farms that are over 100 hectares in size. And the problem here is that this sort of situation limits the entry of new farmers, particularly youth, in these systems. The common agricultural policy also fuels this process in that it allows farmers to buy additional land, and often this land is bought from farmers in the plain, and the land bought is often in terrace lands, just to increase the size and the amount of subsidies a farmer can pocket. So this is a very perverse dynamic that needs to be addressed. We can talk about how to address it, a political response, but also other initiatives like Terre des Liens, which we heard about this morning, a more direct action where people are actually reoccupying land in the same way that MST is doing this in Brazil, but also in Europe. The other one is securing farmers' right to save, exchange, use seeds and livestock breeds. The current regulatory apparatus for seed laws, the rights to what seeds are used and who owns them, encourage genetic uniformity. And this at a time in Europe and elsewhere we're facing with climate change, and we definitely need to find ways of bringing back diversity, biodiversity into the farming landscape and throughout the food chain to make it more resilient to shocks and stresses and change, including climate change and market volatility. But all these seed laws and intellectual property rights need to be reviewed, in a sense, to be able to actually make it possible for people in terrace landscapes to diversify their landscapes and make them resilient through diversification and use of functional diversity from the genetic species to the ecological and landscape level. Now, one feature of this economic, think about economic organization, it focuses very much on relocalizing production and consumption to exit global commodity markets. And here it means re-embedding agriculture in nature, relying on functional diversity and internal resources, and the rediscovery of local assets like local knowledge, local plants that can be used to cure animals. Second, there's a process whereby farmers deliberately distance themselves from markets supplying inputs, seeds, fertilizers, pesticides. Third, a process whereby farmers diversify their outputs and market outlets, usually in short food chains, short food webs, community-supported agriculture, relocalized food systems, and food webs. An emphasis on rebuilding the infrastructure of local food systems, for example, local mills, abattoirs, community food processing units, which create income, livelihoods for other people in rural spaces and peri-urban spaces. And finally, trade rules that protect local economies, for example, local food procurement schemes, which this country has been very successful in implementing. Lots of schools around Rome and elsewhere benefit from local procurement schemes that source organic foods from local farmers around Rome, and they're served to schools and hospitals and so on. Very effective way of creating better markets, local markets and proximity relations between producers and consumers. I'll just say beyond that, there's a need to think hard about what kind of economics we want to live by, the need to rethink economics. I'll just point out here that essentially, when we talk about markets and economics, we refer to money. Sorry, I'm turning my back to you. And it overlooks the importance of more plural forms of economic exchange, which are to do with subsistence, barter, reciprocity, the solidarity economy, which we mentioned this morning. So this need to rethink economics, and here there are interesting things emerging around the degrowth economics, participatory economics, feminist economics, as well as solidarity economics. These are important intellectual resources that we need to look into and use. The final one I want to emphasize is the need to deepen democracy for food sovereignty. It's who decides. And here is a process of institutional and methodological innovations that put farmers, citizens, center stage in the governance of food systems and their daily affairs. It's claiming and realizing citizens' rights to participate in policy making and institutional choice. This is a right enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. You know, it's there. But it also needs to be supported with an economics for the well-being of people and the planet, the links between solidarity economy, degrowth, and circular economy models that can create time and material security for people to engage in participatory politics and more direct forms of democracy. So here, several things I want to highlight. The need in that context to strengthen local organizations for democratic governments. The local adaptive management of these diverse, risk-prone, complex landscape environments does depend on a considerable degree of decentralization and decision-making in subsidiarity, which is recognized by, for example, the Biodiversity Convention. The need to have people deciding on how they're going to manage water, soil, what kind of stones they're going to use to build their terraces, when are they going to harvest, how they're going to do this together. So the importance of local organizations to coordinate collective action and ensure that action is possible on a wide area in a concerted manner. They're also important in determining people's access to land and food. And finally, in terms of political influence, when people come together, and more so when they create federations, coalitions of citizens, they usually have more political clout. They are organized for policy influence. This is important. Many of the debilitating trends we have that are killing terrace landscapes, pauperizing farmers, are the product of deliberate political decisions by a select group of people. That will only change through the balance of social force and processes that give more voice, action to citizens. I think there's no way around that. So I'll skip this one. One aspect of this democratization of the governance is democratizing research and knowledge production. It's striking that universities where I work and many research institutes are not delivering the kind of knowledge, the kind of technologies, the kind of systems that are needed to deal with the pressing social, environmental, and economic problems of this day. If I look in my country, something like 1% of the budget of agricultural research is used to fund agroecological research. In the US, it's 1.5% of the total budget. So no wonder we're not getting, the sort of technologies and approaches we need. And here, it's the nature of knowledge that has to be changed, right? And its embodiments in technology and systems. And there are two ways of doing this, through democratizing science and technology research and advocating for more funds for the public system, but that implies also a greater deal of citizen oversight over public research and procedures that allow citizens to set the agenda, define upstream priorities for research, budgetary allocations. So quite revolutionary in many ways. But if we're talking, democracy, these are the practical implications that have to be considered. How can public research be reclaimed by citizens for the public good? Okay, one more minute. And the other one is deinstitutionalizing research for autonomous learning and action. There is a lot of research and a lot of innovation that takes place outside of universities and research institutes, through horizontal networks, farmer-to-farmer exchange, those processes of farmer-to-farmer exchange, horizontal learning, innovation, have to be supported also. Okay, I'll skip this, thinking more generally about how do we cooperate and how do we implement governance over large areas. It implies forms of social organization and collective action that are much more akin to federative and confederative structures and based on traditions of direct democracy. This is something to explore, and it resonates very much with the kind of collective action needed for the local adaptive management of terraced landscapes, as well as organized cooperation for economic exchanges and decision-making among interdependent communities, be they in terraced landscapes. I want to emphasize this. At a time when, the demography of farmers, particularly in Europe, is such that most of the farmers on average are 60 years old, and we have a situation where lots of younger people want to enter farming. It is important in the context of cooperation and decision-making to be very inclusive of young people, men and women alike. We have to be much more inclusive of gender and difference. We have to think about democratic procedures that provide effective safeguards against the abuse and concentration of power. This is something that has affected all social movements, all progressive emancipatory movements throughout history. So this is something important for our generation and the generation of our children. How do we invent systems that prevent the abuse and concentration of power? I just want to end up with this, is that no point talking about political democracy, expanding political democracy without talking about providing time and material security for people to engage in participatory politics. Two people working, coming back at 10 o'clock at night exhausted, they have no time to deal with that. Yeah? So what can be done? And here there is thinking out there that needs to be assembled and worked by people committed to social change and different futures. I'll just list them. The idea of relocalizing plural economies that combine both market-oriented activities with non-monetary forms of economic exchange based on barter, reciprocity, gift relations, and solidarity. The idea of a guaranteed and unconditional minimum income for all, which the Swiss voted on but didn't get in their referendum. And this one's important. Actually advocating for a significant drop in time spent in wage work and a fairer sharing of jobs and free time between men and women, essentially to make time to engage in social life outside of wage work. There is money around. It's just allocated the wrong way, and there are possibilities of taxing financial speculations to fund the regeneration of local economies and ecologies. And we need generally a shift from globalized, centralized, and linear systems to much more relocalized circular models that mimic natural cycles and link sustainable food and energy production with water and waste management in terraced landscapes located in rural areas and urban areas, but within a territorial context. And I echo the point of the previous speaker there. So these are just thoughts, food for thought, pointers to possible future. It's normative, some will say utopians, unrealistic, but that's the purpose of your meeting, I understand, to shape the future. Thank you.